if I think about how we came up with the strategies across government, it's really thinking about AI from a systems level approach. It's not about using AI for AI's sake. It is about making our industries more competitive, delivering government services better, and helping our citizens also understand and interact with this technology in a way that builds confidence and trust.
Now, if the first session with Clay and the Minister was about Singapore as a global AI powerhouse, as I mentioned in the introduction, we're now going to talk about the extent to which Singapore can be used as a test case for small and medium-tier countries. And Simon, I'm going to start with you. We've heard mentioned that for such a small country, Singapore really does punch above its weight in terms of AI investment and innovation. What lessons should other small and mid-sized countries, maybe the ones we've just seen on the Global AI Index, take from Singapore's success in this area?
Yeah, well, I think it was pretty clear from the outset that a country like Singapore could never compete with China and the United States in terms of scale. So if you can't beat them on quantity, you can at least try and compete on quality. And so we've really invested in talent and in a regulatory environment that encourages innovation. And I think that's maybe something that Singapore is at least an interesting experiment, that in contrast with the kind of European approach, where it's often a kind of oppositional mentality, how do we hold back, how do we protect the rights that might be at stake, that's one approach. The American approach is very hands-off, how do we sort of just fan the flames of the free market, or the Chinese approach, where it's very much state-controlled. Here it's very much intended as a partnership. And so you make a virtue of small size. You make a virtue of having a highly connected, highly educated digital population and a small environment where you can organize events like this, where you get the regulators, the industry, and the think tanks around the same table to try and craft a whole-of-nation strategy that gets everyone aligned on how to take advantage of the digital economy while minimizing or mitigating the risks.
And Shamik, before I ask you a question, I believe you've got a new title as of yesterday that we want to congratulate you on.
Thanks. Yeah, as of yesterday, I've just joined as the head of the AI Verify Foundation, which those of you from Singapore know. And I guess the relevant aspect, thank you. The relevant aspect to Simon's point is, I think, Simon, you mentioned about openness and about a regulatory environment that is encouraging of innovation. So the AI Verify Foundation, for example, takes the approach around AI testing and safety that it shouldn't just be something that people tick boxes against or something that people do because they're asked to do. Instead, how do we make it a forum, a toolkit that allows companies, particularly smaller and medium-sized companies, to adopt AI? So you go from one end, which is, hey, use AI safely or otherwise don't use it, to the other angle, which is, actually, how can we help you adopt AI safely through toolkits? So I think that's a continuation of that theme about encouraging regulatory environment.
And Andrew, I'm going to come to you in 1 second, but before I do, Serena, I wanted to ask you, from your research, are there any small, mid-sized companies that you expect to be shooting up the rankings soon to compete with Singapore?
I would say, yeah, definitely. There are a lot of other countries that I've mentioned earlier also during the presentation that are sort of smaller but also really dynamic AI hubs for different reasons. For example, when it comes to talent, Germany, France, and Canada are quite high on the index. When it comes to investment, Israel and Canada, again, and Korea are also very strong performers. In infrastructure, Canada and India as well, we expect to rank a bit higher. So yeah, it really varies, and I guess it depends on when you look. But yeah, definitely there are other countries aside from Singapore.
And Andrew, we were talking backstage, and Serena was saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Singapore has gone up 6 places in 3 years on the global ranking list. I wonder, I'm interested in your insight on how it has achieved that ascent, really, in a relatively short period of time. What can you pinpoint there?
I think if I think about how we came up with the strategies across government, it's really thinking about AI from a systems level approach. It's not about using AI for AI's sake. It is about making our industries more competitive, delivering government services better, and helping our citizens also understand and interact with this technology in a way that builds confidence and trust.
And what does that look like when you talk about helping citizens understand tangibly? What are you doing to make that happen?
So we spend a lot of effort skilling our workforce, telling them about the new technologies and skills that are required to do better in the workplace. We spend a lot of time engaging with industries and companies to talk about the job redesign that needs to happen so that people can use these technologies effectively. With our seniors and with our school-going children, we spend a lot of time too telling them about some of the ill effects of using AI poorly or using it wrongly. And that, I think, goes a long way into helping people understand what it should be used for and what it shouldn't be used for, and what are some of the things that you need to be aware of as you're dealing in the online space. So these are some of the ways in which we try and educate, build awareness, and also put in place safeguards and guardrails that ultimately tries to promote the use and the investments in it, and not sort of stifle the innovation, even as we care about these important matters of safety and security.
And this I can add to Andrea's point, Singapore also really invested in its research ecosystem. If I remember right, from last year, Singapore's research and development spend per capita was something like 18 times higher than the one of the US, which I think says a lot.
A few of you have mentioned talent and investment in talent being a key reason for Singapore's success. If any of you were advising the governments of France or Denmark, one of those countries in the middle of the list, what would you be telling them they should be doing with their talent investment? What should it be looking like? Shamik, let's start with you.
Well, I think there's also questions of what kinds of talent. So if I look at France, for example, I think in absolute terms, the number of kind of deep tech talent in France might well be higher already. I think one thing Singapore does well, Andrea, you can comment on this, is it looks at talent holistically. It's not only about the person, about the machine learning engineer or the data scientist. It's also about the Singapore Academy of Law, for example. Zikin will speak later today. They're talking about how lawyers can use generative AI more effectively. So I think there's a whole of country approach to AI talent. It's not only about AI development talent or data science talent. It's also about how all of the economy, actually even students, how they use AI. So that's one thing I would certainly advise any country, irrespective of how strong your core AI talent is. You should look at AI enabling the entire workforce and indeed students and elder people even.
That's very time intensive, I imagine, and very resource intensive. Simon, it seems presumptuous in a way to imagine that every government of a small country might have those available resources to funnel into AI integration, society-wide. If those resources aren't available, how does a country approach this rollout?
Yeah, well, again, I think if you're trying to compete on scale, you're going to lose. Yeah. To do well in AI, it's well known, you need talent, you need data, and you need compute or computational power. And not everyone's going to have the computational power, not everyone's going to have the data, but the talent is where you might be able to make a bit of a difference. And so I think the challenge, particularly for developing countries, is whether they want to invest in the hardware and the model development or invest in the talent that can take advantage of that. And I think that goes on to Shamik's point, which is you don't need everyone to be a computer scientist. Indeed, France, I think, is a good and bad example. Good example with initiatives like Mistral is a great new company, but I think about 5 years ago they said, right, we're just going to train everyone in computer science, or 20,000 computer scientists. Computer science is important, but actually more important than just training up AI models for AI models' sake is training the entire economy so that people can look out for opportunities. Because the large language models are pretty good at producing human-like text, they're very good at coding. So the idea that you just need coders, I think, misunderstands the opportunity of AI. It's not just going to be a computer science regime, it's going to be an economy-wide factor that's going to be a bit more like electricity, which transforms whole economies. So not everyone needs to be an electrician, but you need to know how to develop tools that will use electricity or apply electricity in new ways.
So at what point should we be talking to children in schools about AI coding?
So we already are. So AI Singapore, there's free educational opportunities through AI Singapore for everyone. I mean, candidly, I'm a little bit wary about getting kids too young because I think they need their screen-free time.
Yep.
Yeah.
But throughout the education life cycle, certainly at the university level, we're training students to understand the opportunities and the limitations of AI, not because everyone needs to be a computer scientist, although we have great computer scientists, but because the lawyers, like Shamik said, the engineers, everyone's going to need to operate in an environment where AI is hopefully going to enhance their ability to do their job in new ways and hopefully to do new things that they never could have done in the past.
I've got a couple more questions and then I'm going to open it up to you in the room. Andrew, you talked a bit about strategy earlier, and Singapore has remained impressively neutral when it comes to the big AI power blocks. I wonder, is it realistic to think that a country of Singapore's size, an equivalent country, can continue in that way going forward? Or is there ultimately going to be a point where they have to express some sort of loyalty?
I think geographical diversity is absolutely critical as we build AI products and tools for the world. So building on the interdisciplinary nature of AI, as well as the fact that AI understanding can start from any age and anywhere, I do think that it is more powerful and more beneficial when we build AI products that are built by teams of people that are based all over the world, that have specific local and regional contexts that can help us to translate things that will suit that context better, and that can help us to identify safety and security risks that may occur differently in different parts of the world too. So I think the usual binaries is really an artificial construct that we have to constantly work against. I'll give you a couple of examples of how Singapore does this. We obviously collaborate very closely with the US government and with US industry because they are tremendous partners for the Singapore ecosystem. But likewise, we also have conversations with the Chinese government on AI governance policies to build that mutual understanding. There's also a tremendous amount of research that goes on at all levels. Besides that, at ASEAN and at the UN, we are the leaders of a digital forum of small states. That's 108 small countries that are also thinking about the capacity building, the investments that they need in infrastructure, the type of education and upskilling that's required for their workforce. And we use these platforms to talk about really important subjects as to how you might want to govern AI well, what sort of capacity is needed, and how can we learn from each other through all of these various platforms. It's a small start, and but I personally think that it's a really important investment in this international collaboration because the more we understand what is at stake and know that we have friends and partners to guide us through that journey, I think we are a lot better for it.
It's a small start, but it's a mighty start. Shamik, so earlier this year we saw the publication of the ASEAN AI Guide, which appears notably more lenient, I would say, than the EU's AI Act. And I wonder, has Singapore had any response from EU governments? Has there been any pushback to it?
I mean, I'm probably not qualified to speak about whether there's a pushback or not. But I think the point about lenient, I mean, I don't know. There are some aspects of the EU AI law which appear to be restrictive to many people in the industry. But I think a lot of this debate about whether something is lenient versus something is more strict, it's somewhat superficial, with a small number of exceptions around the governance of large language models and foundation models. There's actually a wide degree of agreement around the world. So I would not characterize ourselves as lenient. I think pragmatic would be a better word. And that is true for Singapore. I think that is true for ASEAN and, frankly, for the whole region. And people often, just to continue on the example, I often have a lot of colleagues in the West, in my private sector days, who'd say, well, Asia can go out because they're very liberal and it's wild west out there in terms of, actually, I'm sure you know this, but some of the strictest rules around AI use are actually in China, which is often quoted as the wild west. So I think this, again, not going by the binary, I think Singapore's approach, and indeed the region's approach, is more pragmatic rather than being, and pragmatism can sometimes be very strict and sometimes it can be very liberal.
Simon,
that said,
yes.
I think one of the things that Singapore is really trying to do is navigate between two sets of risks. And there is a risk of under-regulation.
Yeah.
If you expose your citizens to risk, if the Wild West comes, then it can be a really dangerous environment. So we've got to make sure there's a baseline of support. But there's also a risk of over-regulation. Particularly for a small economy like Singapore, over-regulation could drive innovation elsewhere, could constrain it. And I think that's one of the things that this part of the world has really tried to navigate between. And one thing that Singapore has done and that the AI ethics framework that ASEAN adopted also reflects is a realization that we've got to explore this new territory in partnership with industry. And so that's why initiatives like AI Verify are so important, because they're not about telling companies, don't do this. It's about telling companies, okay, how can you use AI responsibly? How can you live up to the standards that you all espouse? How can we navigate this new territory together?
What isn't Singapore doing well that it could be doing better?
All of the above.
More money for research. Sorry, my colleagues at university would kill me.
No, that doesn't count. That's a cop-out, that answer. Any of you? I mean, okay, we can frame it differently. How do you hope Singapore's AI strategy to evolve in the years to come? If we're having this conversation in 5 years' time, what do you think has happened by that point that we're not witnessing now?
So I think if I can respond to this, what I'm seeing, and I believe these are the three sort of core pillars of Singapore's new AI strategy, are infrastructure, talent, and adoption. And I see these three things as being the three things that most new strategies of smaller but quite advanced AI hubs are also focusing on. So infrastructure, compute was mentioned earlier, so high performance compute that can sustain AI systems is really, really key. Canada, I think, secured $2.5 billion recently for high-performance compute infrastructure, and I think this will be something that we will see grow in Singapore as well in other countries. And same for talent retention, high advanced talent, and adoption of AI across different industry and different sectors. India also is really, really banking on this, specifically for sectors like education, healthcare, agriculture, and other ones.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that really will pose a challenge in the coming years, and it came up in the interview with Minister Teo earlier, is the tension between two big challenges of the 21st century, which is technology and climate, and how we get access to the energy we're going to need in a way that still maintains Singapore's environmental commitments. And I think that's going to be a really tough challenge, but it was good to see the Minister and the government is very open to the need to confront that directly.
Mm-hmm. I want to open up the room to see if there are any questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Yes, I can see one straight away at the back, and someone will come to you with a mic. So, and if you could just stand up, say your name, the company you're from, and then ask your question, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks. Rohit Lokre from PayPal. Thanks for the wonderful insights. I was trying to tie this conversation back to the data that we were looking at prior to this. I guess what I'm struggling to reconcile is, I think this one fact that you shared, which was that outside of the China and the US, Asia in general has 2.6% of private investments in AI. Mm-hmm. And I use private investments as a proxy for where there's value, i.e. financial gain, financial benefit, and the 2.6% feels very off, feels unnaturally low, especially for such a large economy. So I'm wondering what the insights are from the panel on what might be the cause. Is it that the value doesn't exist, or the barriers and the foundations to getting to that value are way too high that it doesn't justify the investments? But it just feels very counterintuitive to me, so I'd love to get your thoughts. Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Sure.
Do you want to start?
I feel like I should.
Yeah, you start and then we'll come to you.
Thank you so much for the question. So I think actually the 2.6, I wouldn't consider so low, considering that the US makes up over 60% of global private investment in AI, and China, which is also the second biggest AI player in the world, makes around 9%. So 2.6%, I wouldn't consider is that low, and within it, I think Singapore in 2023 was something like 0.7 billion Singaporean dollars, which I feel is quite high. And I think your point about AI private investment not being, I guess, the main metric, I think AI government spend is also something that we look at in the index, and that is very important when we look at how much AI has been invested, or how much has been invested on AI in the country. I don't know if I'm responding to this right, but
maybe I'll try and do a little bit of squaring the circle here, which is one reason you see this, of course, and I'm speaking now more from my previous private sector angle, is that a lot of the investment numbers are probably more into the fundamental research and or compute side of it. And not just for Singapore, but a lot of Asia's approach to AI is actually about value. Where's the value? Now, you might say, well, that's creates some risks in the long term if we are not the sources of fundamental research. Yes, but in the near term, in the short term, I think the cost of using AI and adopting AI is far lower than the cost of developing brand new large language models, et cetera. So some of that number you're seeing in that. The other thing I say only partly tongue-in-cheek is I did work for a global bank with operations across from US to Asia. We just get more bang for the buck in Asia. That is a reality. I mean, we spend less compared to some of the more expensive centers. And that's not necessarily true for Singapore, but certainly for the region overall. you will get more value. So I think the link between value and investment is probably better here, if I might say so, compared to other parts.
Yeah, there's also the question of whether you rent or buy or build.
Yes, that's true.
And a different kind of angle is I draw the analogy with legal services. So one of the things that's been fundamental to Singapore's success is embrace of the rule of law. Now, legal services is only 0.55% of GDP, so it's a tiny sliver of GDP, but it enables everything else, because only with a trusted legal system that enables you to have finance, a banking sector, which is more like 15% of GDP. AI is going to be the same. You need core investment, but to take advantage of it, that doesn't require you to have all of the data centers in Singapore or indeed in Asia.
I would say that it's also a time dimension to a lot of things that we're talking about. I mean, generative AI has maybe caught the world by storm for only about 20 months. I think many industries and businesses are seriously thinking about how to make that investment worth their time. And as we have seen, as it relates to, say, infrastructure, sometimes it does get cheaper as you wait. It's easier to buy as opposed to build. And I do think that companies and organizations do need to think about the kind of capacity that they have within the organization and outside of it to make that investment worth their while. I also would think that there is a certain dimension of getting over this hype cycle and making sure that we are building for the long haul, which is why I think some strategic patience in this arena is really, really critical, because you have to make these investments, not too different from when we were doing digitalization about 10 years ago. Many people thought that it would pass. Many people thought that I could sort of hold on and wait for it. But it is the businesses that do see the value and make those investments over time that will eventually see the benefits. So I would take that 2.6% with a slight pinch of salt, because I think that's just a snapshot of where people are at today. I hope that in 5-10 years' time, that number will be significantly different.
We've got time for one more question, if it's quick. Anyone got a question? Okay. Yeah. Yes. One at the back.
I'm Eugene from 10 Storen. So I have two questions. So firstly is many nations, right, they're actually investing in RISC-V to really, it's an open source version of ARM, so that they could really protect their supply chain. RISC-V, when they develop RISC-V, it's like an intellectual property to make their own chips. That's number one. So what's Singapore's strategy around that? And number two is, I believe AI compute is extremely important. But my question is, what alternatives are Singapore looking into? Because it's not really good to invest all AI and compute into a certain particular vendor.
I would say that diversity is really important for us also on this particular piece of technology. Just to give some statistics, Singapore is I think we contribute 20% of semiconductor equipment and about 10% of global chip production. But that's not to say that we do all kinds of chips. We have strength in some of them, like memory, for instance. And when it comes to AI, I think while there are certain players that are dominating, we know that it's still a space that will evolve very quickly as the technology evolves too. So I would say in response, the strategy here is to make sure that you have the right chips to do the right things. Our goal is to make sure that that organizations all over here have access to what they need. And from a government standpoint, I think our investments will be, will come across a range of options, from stuff that requires to be on-prem because of our security needs, but where there can be cost efficiencies and technological advantages in being in the cloud, we'll also do that too. And then going back to the question of sustainability, how do we get all of this compute power for much less energy? I think that, again, would be one metric of deciding.
Simon, quick fire answer from you to end.
Very briefly, the objective for a country like Singapore can't be to be the end. We're not going to be the dominant player, but we want to be an indispensable partner. So if Singapore's history can be summed up in 3 sentences: 19th century, a port for goods; 20th century, a port for services; 21st century, a port for data and ideas. So we've got to be part of that information chain, that flow, which requires us to have diverse partners and diverse interests.
I think a last one from me is, I think what will be key is not just investing in high performance compute infrastructure, but also making sure that that is available to industry and researchers to use. And in the same way, we will need public data set platforms with data that can be made available, again, for both industry and researchers to train their AI systems.
Serena, Simon, Shamik, and Andrea, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.